The call came at 6:14 inches the morning, and I remember the exact time because I had been awake for an hour already, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the birds at the feeder my husband built before he passed. When my phone lit up on the table and I saw it was a number from Atlanta, something in my chest pulled tight before I even answered. It was a woman named Carol. She said she was my son Daniel's neighbor. She said she had been watching his house for 3 days because she noticed his car hadn't moved and his mail was piling up. And the previous night, she had seen lights on but no movement, and she had finally knocked that morning and gotten no answer, and she was worried. She asked if I had heard from him recently. I had not. Not in 11 days. I told Carol to call 911. I told her to stay on the phone with me while she did, and before the ambulance had even arrived at Daniel's house in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, I was already in my bedroom pulling clothes out of my closet. Because I had been a family attorney for 31 years before I retired, and I had seen enough of life to know that when something feels wrong at 6 in the morning, it usually is. I was 63 years old. I had driven across state lines for client emergencies before I retired, and I had driven across them for my husband's funeral 4 years earlier, and I had no trouble pointing my car south on I-65 out of Nashville while the sun was still low. I called Daniel's cell phone 6 times before I reached the Tennessee border. It went to voicemail every time. His voice on the recording sounded young to me, the way it always did, and I had to press my lips together and focus on the road. Carol called me back 40 minutes into my drive. The paramedics had gotten inside through an unlocked back window. Daniel was unconscious on the bathroom floor. She said the words severely dehydrated and unresponsive, and then her voice broke a little, and she said she was so sorry. I thanked her. I kept driving. I called my daughter-in-law's number 3 times. Each call went to voicemail after 4 rings. I left one message. I said that her husband was being taken to Piedmont Atlanta Hospital by ambulance and that she needed to get there now. I spoke slowly and clearly, the way I used to speak to witnesses on the stand when I needed them to understand that there was no room for misinterpretation. She did not call me back. I want to explain something about Daniel, so you understand what kind of man he was. He was 41 years old. He had worked for 12 years designing sustainable housing projects for low-income families, the kind of work that didn't make a person rich but made the world slightly less indifferent. He had his father's eyes and his father's habit of leaving handwritten notes on the kitchen counter when he wanted to say something important. He was not the kind of man who complained. I used to call him every Sunday evening, and when I asked how he was doing, he would say, "Pretty good, Mom," even during the months when I later learned things were not pretty good at all. He had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 38. It was manageable. His doctor had told us both, with proper monitoring and routine. It required consistency. It required someone nearby who paid attention. When I walked into the ICU at Piedmont Atlanta at noon, Daniel was connected to 2 IV lines and a heart monitor, and he had the look of a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His cheekbones were too sharp. His lips were cracked. The nurse told me he had been in diabetic ketoacidosis, that his blood sugar had been critically high for what she estimated was 4 to 5 days, that he had been unconscious for at least 18 hours before anyone found him. I held his hand. It was cool and dry and still. I looked at the monitor and listened to the steady beep, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth the way I had taught myself to do in courtrooms when I needed to stay composed. Then I asked the nurse if anyone else had come in, any family, any emergency contacts. She checked the file. His emergency contact was listed as Vanessa Hargrove, his wife. She had not been notified by the hospital because, the nurse explained gently, they had called the number on file and it had gone to voicemail, and their protocol required a family member to be present before they could provide details to outside callers. No one had come. I sat beside my son for 2 hours before my phone showed a text message from Vanessa. It said, "Saw your voicemail. I'm in Savannah with the girls. What's going on?" I stared at that message for a long time. Then I typed back, Daniel is in the ICU at Piedmont, Atlanta. He has been here since this morning. You need to come now. Her response came 4 minutes later. It said, "Oh my God, is he stable? I booked a weekend trip months ago. It's already paid for. Can you handle things until Monday?" It was Saturday. I put the phone face down on my knee and looked at my son's face and did not allow myself to feel the full weight of what I had just read, because if I allowed myself to feel it completely, I would not be able to do what needed to be done. I had learned that discipline from 31 years of sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives. You do not get to fall apart when someone else is depending on you to hold things together. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Webb, who had been my colleague for 2 decades before she took over my practice when I retired. I told her where I was and why. I told her I needed to know the exact status of Daniel's estate documents, because Daniel and I had spoken about this 2 years earlier when his diagnosis came through, and he had called me on a Sunday evening and for the first time in his life had not said "pretty good, Mom" when I asked. Patricia called me back in 20 minutes. She told me that Daniel had revised his will 18 months ago. He had established a revocable living trust. I was named as the successor trustee in the event that Daniel became incapacitated or passed. He had been thorough, the way his father had been thorough, the way people who have watched someone they love die of a sudden illness become thorough about these things. I want to say something about what I did next, because I've had people ask me since then whether I acted too quickly, whether I should have waited, whether I was wrong to do what I did while my son was still fighting in that hospital bed. The truth is that I had spent 31 years watching families torn apart by exactly the kind of carelessness I was looking at. I had watched surviving spouses drain accounts before the body was cold. I had watched joint assets disappear into personal accounts and vacation funds and second households that the other spouse never knew existed. I had watched people I could not help because by the time they came to me, there was nothing left to protect. I was not going to watch that happen to my son. Through the trust documents Patricia sent me electronically, and my authority as successor trustee given Daniel's documented incapacitation, I worked with Patricia over the next 4 hours to secure Daniel's financial accounts and protect the assets held under the trust. It was not dramatic. It was paperwork. It was the thing I had spent a career doing, and I did it quietly, with my hand resting on the bed rail near my son's arm, and when it was done, I felt not satisfaction, but something more like the grim steadiness of a soldier who has secured the perimeter and now has to wait. Vanessa arrived on Monday morning. I had been at the hospital for 48 hours by then, sleeping in the chair beside Daniel's bed, eating from the vending machine down the hall, talking to the doctors every time they came in. Daniel had regained consciousness on Sunday afternoon. His first words to me were quiet and a little blurred, and he said my name, and I said I was here, and his hand moved slightly in mine. I was standing in the hallway near the nurse's station when Vanessa walked out of the elevator. She was 38 years old, and she was wearing a white linen blouse and sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and she had the light tan of someone who had spent the weekend somewhere warm and pleasant. She was carrying an iced coffee from the place on the ground floor of the parking deck. She hugged me. The iced coffee was cold against my back. She said she had driven up as soon as she could get away, that the drive from Savannah was long, that she was exhausted. She asked how Daniel was. I told her. She nodded in the way people nod when they want to appear to be absorbing information. Then she asked whether the doctors had said anything about a timeline for discharge. I told her it would be at least a week, possibly longer. He needed supervised monitoring and a full review of his care routine. She made a small sound with her mouth, not a sound of distress, more like the sound a person makes when a meeting gets rescheduled. She went in to see him then. I stood outside the glass and watched for a few minutes, and then I walked to the end of the hallway and stood by the window looking out at the city and the mid-morning sky, and I let myself feel, briefly, the thing I had been holding at arm's length since Saturday morning. Then I put it back where it belonged and walked back to the room. Over the next 3 days I learned things I had half suspected and had hoped were not true. I learned them partly from Daniel, who talked to me in the quiet hours when Vanessa stepped out, and partly from Carol, who had been watching the house for longer than 3 days, and partly from the simple arithmetic of a woman who had spent a career examining financial records. Daniel had been struggling with his health management for over a year. His insulin levels had been inconsistent. He had been waking in the night with low blood sugar and handling it alone. He had asked Vanessa to help him maintain a monitoring schedule. She had, for a few months, and then she had stopped. And when he brought it up, she told him he was being needy, that he needed to manage his own medical condition, that she had her own life to live. He had not told me any of this. He had called me on Sunday evenings and said pretty good, "Mom," and I had believed him because I had wanted to believe him. There was a letter on the nightstand beside his hospital bed. He had written it 2 weeks before I arrived, during a stretch of days when he had been feeling unwell and had been afraid of what that might mean. He had not mailed it. He had written it to me. He told me in that letter that he had already revised the trust, that he wanted his assets, after the house was sold and the debts were settled, to fund something he had been thinking about for years, a small grant program through his firm's foundation that would support young architects from low-income backgrounds, covering the cost of their licensure exams and their first year of professional membership fees. He said the barriers to entry in his field were invisible to people who had never faced them, and he wanted to remove some of those barriers for kids who had his same passion, but not his same advantages. He said he was sorry he had not called more. He said he knew I would handle things the right way. He said he loved me. I read that letter, sitting in the chair beside his bed while he slept, and I held it in my lap for a long time afterward, and I did not cry until I was in the parking garage with no one around, and then I cried the way a person cries when they have been holding something heavy for 4 days and their arms simply give out. Daniel came home from the hospital after 8 days. He was thinner and quieter than he had been, and he moved more carefully. The way people move when their body has reminded them it is not invincible. He went home to the house in Buckhead. I went with him. Vanessa had gone back to Atlanta 2 days after she arrived, because she had a work function she could not miss. She had kissed Daniel on the forehead when she left. She had told me to call if anything changed. She had not asked whether I needed anything. In the weeks that followed, I stayed. I slept in the guest room, and I made sure Daniel ate on schedule, and I drove him to his follow-up appointments, and I watched my son rebuild himself slowly, carefully, the way a person rebuilds when they understand for the first time that they were fragile all along and just did not know it. I also watched his marriage. I am not a woman who involves herself in her children's relationships. I had bitten my tongue more times than I could count over the 6 years Daniel and Vanessa had been together. I had smiled at dinners and asked polite questions, and kept my observations to myself the way a mother does when she loves her child enough to let him make his own choices. But what I watched in those weeks in Atlanta was not something I could file away quietly in the category of choices I had to respect. I watched a man who had nearly died ask his wife for small things to pick up his prescription when she passed the pharmacy, to check the refrigerator before she ordered takeout so they didn't run out of the foods his doctor had recommended, to come home before 10 on Tuesday nights, when he had an early monitoring check on Wednesdays. I watched her agree and then not follow through. And when Daniel said something about it, she told him he was micromanaging her life, that his illness was not her responsibility to babysit, that she had married him not his pancreas. She said that last part out loud. I was in the kitchen. I do not think she knew I was still in the house. I went upstairs and called Patricia. What happened next I will describe plainly, because it does not need embellishment. The trust documents Daniel had drawn up were clear. The assets held within the trust were protected from individual action by either spouse. This had been Daniel's choice and his right, and it was perfectly legal. Vanessa had no access to those funds, and she never had. What she did have access to were the joint checking and savings accounts they held together for household expenses. Over the course of the previous 14 months, I discovered through the account records that Daniel had authorized me to review as trustee. Roughly $62,000 had moved from those joint accounts into purchases and transactions that were exclusively attributable to Vanessa. vacations he had not taken, a wardrobe I had never seen him wearing, a weekend property rental in Tybee Island that had been booked 15 times in 12 months, always when Daniel was traveling for work or, as I now understood, unwell and resting at home. I did not go to Daniel with this immediately. I went to Patricia. Then I went to a family law attorney Patricia recommended, a woman in Atlanta named Susan Cho who had 20 years of experience in exactly this kind of case. Then the three of us sat down together and talked through what the options were. Daniel found out not from me, but from the letter Susan sent through proper channels. He called me the night he received it. His voice was very quiet. He asked me if I had known for a long time. I told him I had known for 3 weeks. He was silent for a moment, and then he said he thought he had known too, in the way a person knows something they are not ready to look at directly. We talked for 2 hours that night. It was the longest phone call we had had since the Sunday evenings after his father died, when he used to call just to talk. Not about anything specific, just to hear a voice that connected him to something that still felt solid. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to do what was right. I asked him to tell me what that meant to him. He said it meant protecting what he had built, and not handing any of it to someone who had treated it as an inheritance, to wait for rather than a life to share. He filed for divorce in November. Vanessa's attorney contacted Susan within 2 weeks with an initial request for a settlement that included half of Daniel's retirement accounts, a buyout of her share of the house, and monthly spousal support for 3 years, based on her claim that she had reduced her professional advancement during the marriage to support Daniel's career. Susan presented them with the account records, the transactions, the timeline against Daniel's documented hospital admissions and medical appointments, the dates of the Tybee Island rentals against the dates in Daniel's medical records when his health had been at its most precarious. The settlement conversation became significantly shorter after that. Vanessa left with what was legally hers from the joint accounts, minus what Susan's documentation established had been spent unilaterally without Daniel's knowledge or consent. She received nothing from the trust. She received nothing from the house, which had been purchased prior to the marriage and had always remained in Daniel's name alone. She received no spousal support. She signed the papers on a Thursday in January, and her attorney called Susan to say she wanted to discuss the situation further. And Susan told him there was nothing left to discuss. I was in Nashville when I got the call that it was finalized. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the birds at the feeder my husband built. I said thank you to Patricia, who had called to tell me. Then I sat there for a while in the quiet of the house and thought about my husband, and about Daniel, and about the kind of love that stays at the bedside, and the kind that books a beach house and waits. Daniel called me that Sunday evening. I asked how he was doing. He said, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, "I'm actually pretty good, Mom." His voice sounded different when he said it. Lighter, like a man who has set down something heavy he had been carrying for so long he forgot it wasn't supposed to be part of him. He is doing well now. His health is stable. He has a care routine he follows, with the same quiet discipline he applies to everything. And he has a neighbor named Carol, who checks on him with a regularity that I find deeply comforting from 200 miles away. He called me in February to tell me that the board of his firm's foundation had approved the grant program. They named it the Arthur T. Mercer Fund for Emerging Architects. After his father, the first cohort of recipients would be announced in the spring. He read me the names of the first 4 recipients over the phone, 3 young women and 1 young man, all under 28, all first-generation college graduates, all on the verge of a career they had worked years to reach and needed only one specific hand extended at exactly the right moment. I wrote their names down on a piece of paper and put it on the refrigerator. There are things I wish had been different. I wish Daniel had called me sooner. I wish I had asked harder questions on those Sunday evenings, instead of accepting pretty good as an answer because I wanted it to be true. I wish the people we marry would always become who we need them to be, instead of who they were already decided to be before we met them. But I have learned, in 63 years and a 31-year career, spent watching families navigate the worst moments of their lives, that you cannot rewrite what has already happened. You can only decide what you do when you arrive. I arrived. That is the part I know I got right. I still think about Carol sometimes, a stranger who knocked on a door because something felt wrong, and she could not bring herself to look away. There is a kind of ordinary courage in that, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just picks up the phone and makes the call, that stays on the line until someone answers. I sent her flowers in March. The card said only, "Thank you for being the person who showed up." Because that is the whole lesson. Really, that is everything. My husband used to say that the measure of a person is not what they do when it is easy, but what they do when the cost is real. He was a quiet man who believed in doing the right thing even when the right thing was inconvenient and expensive and took longer than you had planned. He believed in showing up. I am his widow and Daniel's mother and a retired attorney from Nashville, Tennessee, and I have spent 63 years learning to be the kind of person who gets in the car at 6 in the morning when the call comes, who holds a hand in an ICU while the monitors beep and the world outside continues on without pausing, who does the paperwork quietly and correctly because someone has to, and because the people she loves deserve to have someone who knows how. That is the whole story. It is not a simple one. It does not have a villain who goes to prison, or a hero who receives a medal. It has a son who nearly died and then decided to live more carefully, and a mother who drove south on a Saturday morning because some things you do not wait on, and a fund in Atlanta named after a man who built a bird feeder and believed in doing right by people. It has 4 young architects who do not yet know that the path in front of them got a little wider because of a man they will never meet who wrote a letter from a hospital bed thinking not about himself but about the barriers other people face. That is who Daniel is. That is who his father was. That is the family we are.